So how does a city start to build resilience? Well, we have been looking at this. There's about 10 or so people around the world right now looking at resiliency. And these are the 6 things that sort of are the consensus of what cities should be doing to start building resiliency into their various systems. Reduce energy required. Reduce the overall net energy required in the cities, because as peak oil kicks in, the cost for energy goes up, meaning that all of the costs for operating a city, all the energy cost will be greater. It means $1 more spent on energy is $1 less that can be spent on any sort of social good. So getting to a point where you can reduce energy inputs now before that starts to become a real problem down the road is very important. Increase self-sufficiency. What's self-sufficiency speaking to? It's speaking to the relocalization of manufacturing and the relocalization of food production. Actually, I should say relocalization. In Edmonton's case, the localization of food production. Why is this? Jeff Rubin, in his book last year called Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, is all about the impact on North America of peak oil. And he says, as oil hits $2.50 a barrel, cars take the off-ramp. Well, it becomes very expensive to transport materials, food, goods. What's now a marginal cost becomes a very, very significant cost. And the other point he makes, which is very interesting, he says, outsourcing comes home. Outsourcing now works because we send the manufacture of goods over to Asia, to China, to India, offshore, because transportation costs are not a significant part of that economic equation. The labor costs are the significant part. But if all of a sudden oil costs, fuel costs start to go up, it means that those transportation costs become a significant part of that. So all of a sudden, food coming up from Mexico to Edmonton gets a heck of a lot more expensive. So right now it's not economical for Edmonton to start building greenhouses to grow food. But maybe as you plan, over time, you plan for opportunities for that to be implemented down the road when the economies of energy allow for it. Increase redundancy. What's redundancy? Redundancy is all about systems that if one part of the system fails, another part of the system can pick up the slack. A good example of this, of non-redundancy is just-in-time inventory. If a truck fails somewhere on number 2 coming up here, Walmart won't have whatever it is you want to get because everything is just in time inventoried. Just like systems, other sorts of systems that are related to providing power and water in a city, if you have one main station for producing power and is hit by a significant weather event, a hurricane, a big windstorm, and it goes down, it takes the power down for the whole city or a portion of the city. We saw this happen in the northeastern seaboard in 2003. So what you want to be doing is looking for opportunities to develop redundancy in infrastructure systems within your city. Increased durability. Durability is something that architects care about in terms of the buildings they design and make. As you increase the energy levels of storm events, buildings are going to take more of a beating. So you want to be building your buildings to be able to withstand those future higher numbers and higher intensities of storms. Integrated with the environment, this is something that Edmonton has been doing a pretty good job of, but as you build or as you plan and as you build in the future, look at building in places where you're working with the environment as opposed to against the environment. Look at all the instances on the Gulf Coast where there are thousands of buildings, cities built right in floodplains. This is not being integrated with the environment. You want to really be careful about how you connect with the environment because it's going to have a much more significant impact in the future. And increased diversity. This is a sort of a Darwinistic type of criteria. It says you don't know what system or what kind of entity, commercial entity or whatever it is, that is going to be successful in the future, so let's have a diversity of them so that something or some group will be more successful than others. If you just have one and it fails, then it fails for all. So what did we do when the city came to us, and this is myself and another staff member at Dialogue, to write this paper? Well, first of all, being from Toronto, I don't know Edmonton like you know Edmonton. So we were looking at it from about 20,000 feet. We were also talking to people like Keith Robinson here about the kind of nitty-gritty that made Edmonton tick. But we were looking at the kind of things that would manifest themselves to an outsider and provide answers back enough that we can bring them back to you, people that really understand Edmonton, to look at and see whether or not they're going to make sense. And what kind of analysis we did was what we call a twos. You've heard of a SWOT. A twos is sort of a modification of it. T stands for threats, W stands for weaknesses, O stands for opportunities, and S stands for strengths. So what we started to do is look at all of the potential threats to the city of Edmonton that are going to come out of peak oil and climate change. We didn't see much in the way of population. Edmonton is really not going to take a significant impact from population down the road the way coastal cities will. So we focused on peak oil and climate change. And we said, what kind of significant threats are there going to be that Edmonton has to think about? What possible weaknesses in Edmonton and its systems? What are the opportunities to overcome those weaknesses and deal with those threats? And what are the kind of strengths that the city has that will help make those opportunities work? So, key threats and weaknesses. How many people here are from or visited Ontario? Okay, so you can't walk more than about 20 minutes without stumbling into a ravine, a river, a pond, or a lake in Ontario. It's just covered with water everywhere. When you grow up in Ontario, you grow up beside water. When I first came to Edmonton, the first thing I noticed was there was no water except one big river that sort of wound its way through the city. And it was a little bit disconcerting. It took me a while to find out why I found the city sort of odd from a geographical point of view, and that was the reason. And as we started to look at the potential for a potential threat to Edmonton, the first thing that occurred was, well, how sustainable is the river into the future? And as we looked at the research, it's not conclusive how sustainable it is. I don't mean it's not sustainable, it's just there are different points of view. And if you look at this is a graph showing the mean annual North Saskatchewan river flows at 5-year running averages. See these various dots taken at various times of the year, and the overall average of flow is sloping gently downwards. So this means that over time, the river volume is, over the last 10 years, the river volume is decreasing. Well, it's not decreasing at a rate that's going to stop Edmonton from having enough water for drinking water or from using it for industrial purposes. But then the question is, what happens if there's a more significant discontinuity in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years where you have a period of 5-year drought? And as you know, this century has been a very wet century for the Canadian prairies. The past 2 centuries before that were very dry. Who's to say that the next century will be a wet century? So what if there's a 5-year drought? Will this flow just continue on that line, or will it drop off precipitously? I don't know. If you talk to the engineering people at EPCOR, they say that their studies indicate that the flow of the river is not going to be a problem into the future. Well, that's good. The question is, does it still mean that you don't want to think about building resilience in and potentially reducing water demand and so forth in the future. Something to think about. Energy. You, like most North American cities, have an aging infrastructure for energy systems. You're growing rapidly, and the energy demand in Edmonton and region is equivalent to 1 red deer per year, about 86,000 people worth of power required added every year. Your regulatory authority says that right now the capacity is not there to meet that increase. So that's certainly an issue. What are you going to do about that? Question we asked. Food. A lot of good topsoil, alluvial soil, is now under developed land. So you have a low level of local food supply. Now, having said that, Edmonton is a subarctic climate, and therefore you only had a few months of growing season anyway, so it's not as if you could produce food for yourselves throughout the year, just as no place in Canada can do that. But nevertheless, your own local food supply that you had before has been limited by this development. Transportation. Edmonton now is heavily dependent on automobile transportation, just like every other North American city after the, starting in the 50s, massive suburban expansion, therefore lots of highways, lots of arterial roads, lots of paving, and lots of cars to get people from one place to another. This is a threat because as peak oil puts up the prices of fuel, commuting and moving goods around becomes much more expensive. If those were the threats, and you're probably thinking, well, nothing new about that. I've heard that before. Right. What are the opportunities for building resilience? So the first opportunity, I think, is something that you're actually planning for. This is a picture from your downtown master plan that you're developing. Actually, Dialogue is developing it with the City of Edmonton. And it's calling for higher density. Density is a really important thing. Density does a number of things. It allows for the decrease in the amount of commuting that is required. It reduces the amount of energy that an individual has to expend to keep themselves warm in the winter, because clustering buildings around one another in terms of being joined to one another reduces the actual amount of energy required. Another one. Develop an existing building reskinning program to increase energy performance. A lot of buildings in Canadian cities were built in the 50s and 60s and 70s when the economy was hot, and those buildings were not built with much insulation. This is a diagram from Graham Stewart, who's working at ERA in Toronto now, and this is a plan that the City of Toronto is implementing across all of its social housing. It owns hundreds of high-rise apartment buildings, mid-rise apartment buildings in the City of Toronto and the GTA, and it will be recladding all of these buildings over the next 10 years in order to drive the costs of operating them down. Right now, the operating costs are high in energy in the winter. As fuel prices go up, those prices will rise in pursuit. So, certainly an opportunity for the city to consider as well. Explore implementing community-scale district generation that uses mixed fuels. Remember when I was talking about redundancy? Typically, when cities go after new generation facilities, they go after large plants. Why? Because of efficiency. If you have a larger plant, you have a lower cost in terms of operating it, in terms of personnel costs, in terms of land costs, and so forth.